Hello again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with our Sunday school lesson, which this is what we've been doing online since the pandemic started in lieu of the Sunday school we had at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. And we're going to proceed on through the Old Testament, giving you a comprehensive look at a very complicated book, the Old Testament. There's all kinds of things in it. There's legend, there's history. We're in the history section now. There's a thought things, wisdom like Psalms and Proverbs and other books. And there's a lot of prophetic books, some of which are very important to us and some of which are, more straight-laced into an era at the time, like if there was having a famine or something. So we'll work our way through large sections of this, and I'm enjoying it. It's been very good for me to do this. We're into 2 Samuel now, the first part of 2 Samuel, which is really the chapters 2 through 9. This is when David becomes king. And as I've said before, there's a lot of complicating things most people aren't aware of. You think David became king shortly after he killed Goliath. He didn't. It was many, many years. Last week we talked about his outlaw phase, where he was a guerrilla fighter hiding in the hills to keep away from King Saul, who wanted to kill him, because King Saul thought correctly that David was trying to usurp the throne and take it over for himself. He actually worked with the enemy Philistines for a while. Some of them trusted him, some of them didn't, and he eventually deserted them and came back up in hiding again in the southern part. He had great loyalty from the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah was in the southern part, centered around Bethlehem and Hebron, names that we're well familiar with now. And it was about 40% of the population of all the 12 tribes together. Saul came from the smallest tribe, which is Benjamin. And in the end, much later, Benjamin affiliated with Judah and stayed in the southern kingdom. But at this time, it was allied with the northern tribes. It's a very complicated history in great detail. And this is the detail that exceeds what you usually get in the Old Testament at this point. And that's because by this time, which is about 1000 BC, Hebrew had become a written language. It's called Proto-Hebrew, preliminary Hebrew. Early Hebrew is a better term for it. And it's written differently than the more box type of modern Hebrew, which is an evolution from that. Writing changes over time, like grammar changes over time, language, word meanings change over time. And so this was Proto-Hebrew, but he had a written history. So he probably had a court historian, because some of the stories you're having here, the only way you could know them is if the one or two individuals involved could tell the court historian, yeah, I took this, I did that, and this and that. And so it probably is a much more direct and accurate account than the more legendary things from a couple hundred years before, which were passed down verbally. So that's an interesting point to make. And what's happened just at the end of the last lesson, Saul and his oldest son Jonathan and most of his other sons got in a huge battle with the Philistines in the northern part of the kingdom up near Megiddo. There's a valley there called the Valley of the Jezreel, which is the main artery for trade and military conquest from people coming off the coastal plain down on the Mediterranean to cut up through the mountains and get up in the area up in Syria and then into the Fertile Crescent. So it's the most important natural conduit of commerce and military in that area. And that's where the fortress of Megiddo is on one side. And they had a battle on Mount Gilboa on the other side. And the Philistines slaughtered them. Basically, they thrashed them. They killed Jonathan. They killed multiple of Jonathan's brothers. And Saul ends up killed also. Now, the accounts basically say that Saul either killed himself or had someone kill him. Doesn't make a lot of difference. And then David is left without this rival king who'd been chasing him around. So David is confused as to what to do, and he receives a divine message that he is to go back to his home tribe of Judah, where he's very popular, and proclaim himself king, or have him proclaimed king by the leaders of the tribe of Judah. Again, this is 40% of the whole Hebrew population. So he does that. And Hebron functions as the capital at this point because Jerusalem was still controlled by the original group called the Jebusites, the non-Hebrew people. It's very tough to take Jerusalem. And so they were holding it and holding out. And so his capital is based at Hebron, about 35 miles to the south. That's where the cave where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are buried, and their wives under the cave with the very ancient church, actually a temple on top of it. And I've been in the temple, but I haven't been down underneath. It's interesting because there's no mention of David's previous anointing as king by Solomon, way back when David is a youth. It's just not mentioned. This is the interesting problem that you have scholarly-wise of sorting which one of these are accurate and which one aren't. Could both of these be accurate? Yeah, they could. Could one of them have grown up over legend? It's possible. It's probably that he really was anointed king of Judah in a ceremony at Hebron, because you're really getting into the era where it's now written down, or shortly, 10 years later or so, by his court historian. So I suspect that did happen, but there's no mention of Samuel's anointing of them. So he becomes the ruler of the southern part, 40% of the population. And Saul's general, Abner, it doesn't say how Abner got away in this defeat. Everybody, all the big shots got killed but him. He may not be as courageous as you think. He may have seen it coming and gotten himself out. And so he basically begins to run the northern kingdom, which is the other 11 tribes, because Saul's old tribe of Benjamin, it's very small, is allied with the other tribes. This is the northern part above Jerusalem, up to the valley of the Jezreel where that battle took place, and even a little bit across the Jordan up above. And he basically runs that. Now he takes Saul's sole surviving son, a guy called Ishbaal, and he doesn't seem to have much oomph when you read about him. He can't, Ishbaal does. He doesn't seem to have much get up and go. He basically lets Abner run the country. And this is a tricky thing. When the general puts you in as a figurehead, you got to be careful, because if he puts you in as a figurehead, he can take you out, often by taking off your own head. So it's a very tricky thing that Ishbaal was in. But he really just let Saul run the country. And this leads to a war between the 11 northern tribes and the tribe of Judah. And Abner is the leader of the tribe of the north, and David has his own general, a man named Joab. Joab's an interesting character. He remains fiercely loyal to David through David's whole time. Many times your general is your biggest threat, that the general's going to try to depose you, like Abner here had done, taking over the northern kingdom. But Joab apparently had no interest in doing that. He was very loyal to David. He supported him through all kinds of traumatic situations, and was very, very helpful. But Joab takes over command, and they have a battle north of the Jerusalem area, and the forces of King David of Judah beat the northern forces and drive them back. And after this battle, then Abner is fleeing. He's good at getting away. His men may die, but he gets away. So he's fleeing again, and Joab and his two brothers chase after him because they want to finish this guy off. They know this guy is nothing but trouble. And Joab has one of the brothers who, as they say in the scripture, runs like a gazelle. Now, no one's ever said anything like that about me, because I am beyond slow, on the slow side. Wish I weren't, but I am. And so he's chasing after Abner, and Abner turns and sees him, and they shout at each other, and Abner spears him right through with the spear, and he leaves him there to die. So Abner gets away, but he makes a lifetime enemy out of Joab because he had killed Joab's brother. And so he gets back up to the north, and he's basically effectively taken over completely. That, Ishbaal is around as a puppet. There's no pretense to it. Then there's an incident, and you'll see several of these incidents when these people start to squabble over women. Now, David by this time has multiple wives and multiple concubines, but Abner takes a woman who had been a concubine, not a wife, just a kept mistress. This is an official term in the Old Testament. That was an official position, and makes her his concubine. And Ishbaal complains to him, "Hey, how could you take one of my father's concubines into your own harem?" And Abner just erupts in anger at him, shouts at him, threatens him, etc., etc. And Ishbaal knows, he can't handle this guy. He just can't. Abner's too strong for him, and he basically gets intimidated and retreats and just thinks, okay, I'm just going to be intimidated and I'm going to hold on because David's winning this war. I can't win the war without Abner, and so I'm just going to have to put up with it. But Abner begins to think, am I ever going to be able to win this one? Is this guy Ishbaal worth fighting over? Probably not. But I think Abner's more concerned with himself, and so he begins to, like many people in this kind of civil war inside an ethnic group, begins to think, now, do I really want to risk my neck for this guy, or do I want to make my best deal? So he decides he's going to try to make a deal with David, to sell out Ishbaal. Nice guy, huh? And make a deal with David. So he goes down to have a meeting with David down in the Hebron area, and David puts out a big feast, and put this big thing, and he's welcoming him in because it's easier to corrupt this guy than it is to have to fight him all the time. That makes sense. He doesn't say that, but that's the thinking. I'm certain David didn't trust Abner at all because, if he's going to betray his other king, he certainly will betray David the first chance he got. So he had the big feast, etc., and then he lets him go. And on the way back, he's going north, and then Joab and his army people come in from a raid somewhere, and they're coming in with all this booty, and they hear that Abner has been in the camp with David, and they think, hey, we're not going to put up with this, and so they chase after him, and they catch him and they kill him, and as revenge for having killed their brother. Okay, I mean, this is the way it is. And Ishbaal is even more afraid now. He was afraid of Abner, but he's afraid of life without Abner. So what does he do? He kind of goes into semi-hiding because he thinks he has enough sense to realize that the game is probably up, that he can't handle. If Abner couldn't handle David, and if King Saul couldn't handle David, Ishbaal is never going to be able to handle David. So he's kind of hiding away in a house. And there's two scoundrels, we won't go over their names because it doesn't matter, who think they can by doing away with him, increase their position with David. So they sneak into the house during the midday nap. It's so hot there that there's a lot of what was called siesta in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, a mid-afternoon nap because of the heat of the day. And so he's in his room, in his house, sleeping, and his one person with him is asleep outside, and these two guys sneak in and kill him, cut off his head. That's the proof. How do you know? How do I know you killed him? Well, here's his head. I guess that would convince you. And take his head. They take his head to David, and they're thinking they're going to get this big reward. You got to remember David's history. David does not tolerate people killing Saul or Saul's relatives. And so these two guys come in, and we brought you the son of David's, son of Saul, brought his head to you. What reward do we get? And their reward, of course, was David had his men kill them. And he does proper mourning. He fasts. He put on ashes and sackcloth, etc. Because Ishbaal was the son of the king. He was of royal blood. And David respected and did not want to slaughter the king and the king's descendants. Remember, in the last lesson, he had two opportunities easily to kill Saul himself personally, and passed on both of them because he wasn't going to kill the Lord's anointed. Okay, so it's interesting. People didn't understand him, but he had very strong beliefs in this. So finally, the people of the northern kingdom throw in the towel and say, okay, we would like David as our king. he's clearly much better than any other choice. And they go up and anoint him. Now, he had been king for Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and he was king of the combined kingdom for 35 years after they were merged. Shortly after this, he decides to capture Jerusalem. Now, this is very difficult. If you look at the history of Jerusalem, it's been very difficult to capture. It's high, it has its own spring and water supply, and it's got a lot of limestone around where you can make stone walls. And in those days where you didn't have drones, you didn't have airplanes, you didn't have explosives, all you had were bronze or iron-tipped weapons, swords, shields, spears, arrows. You could throw stones at each other. When you're inside the fort and they attack, you throw a lot of stones down on them. And it's an interesting thing. And our cat has just wandered in to join us. I don't know if he's going to get into the picture. I don't think so. But she's always welcome here. And so he's able to capture it. Now, there's no description here in 2 Samuel as to how he does it. But in Chronicles, let me look and get the line here. It's 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 4 through 9. It describes very briefly that Joab is able to get inside through the water system and basically open the gates to let everybody in. There's been a lot of debate about how he did this in the archaeological literature. Most people think that he knew about this. Maybe someone had told him, and he was in it. There's a spring up higher, and that water has dissolved a track of the limestone. Remember, limestone is very sensitive to dissolving and making caves and caverns and passageways. The reason you have so many caves down in Kentucky around Mammoth Cave is it's limestone underneath, and there's underground rivers, and that just, dissolves these channels underground. So they had a channel down to from the spring up above down to what's now the Pool of Siloam down below. It's been changed, and apparently he gets in there and scrunches his way up this passageway. This is what people presume, and gets inside, probably in the middle of the night, open the gates, and they come charging in, and David captures Jerusalem. Probably wasn't a lot of manpower in there. It's pretty much surrounded by the Hebrews by this time. So David declares this the city of David. Now, this part of Jerusalem is not up on the top where the Temple Mount is now. If you're familiar with the geography, the Temple Mount is an area which was the old Mount Moriah where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac and all that. That's been flattened, leveled by first by King Solomon and then by King Herod into this flat land. That's up above. The city of David is down the hill to the south and southwest, down on this promontory. It's much smaller. The archaeologists are just digging in there now in the last 10 years. But there's not a lot to find above the bedrock. There's only about yay much, and so of the original footer and stuff. So it's hard to decipher, but they're working on it right now. The Israelis are very good archaeologists. Maybe we'll see something in the next 10 years about this. But that's where it was, the city of David, farther down. As Jerusalem expanded, it moved up because it's much higher and much easier to defend up there. So he captures the city. And he wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. So he has, and it's just kind of sitting in the other area outside, not really in any major city. And he's received this divine message about God doesn't like it. He's just in a tent, and David has had a cedar palace built for himself by the king of the Sidon area up in Lebanon. And so he's thinking he should bring the ark in and have a palace for it. And the message is, no, not especially, I don't need a palace. And so he's bringing it in, and it's about to tip off the wagon, and one of his supporters puts his hand out to steady it so it doesn't fall to the ground, and touches it. And the person is struck dead by the force of God for having touched the ark when he wasn't qualified to do so. So David thinks, this could be bad news. So he takes the ark down to the Philistine city, which by this time, they're under David's control. Instead of controlling David as they did 10 years before, he's gotten so strong that he's able to dominate them. And it stays there, and they're blessed with all these good tidings. And David begins to think, I shouldn't be afraid of this ark. I should be afraid of not having it. So he goes down there and retrieves it and brings it in to have a ceremonial arrival into Jerusalem. And so they bring it into the city, and David is out in a loincloth, not particularly terribly dignified for the king, dancing wildly, whirling, and all this excitement for having brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city of David, into Jerusalem. His first wife, if you remember back a couple lessons, was a woman named Michal, who was one of the daughters of King Saul. And she had fallen in love with David when he was a young man. He's apparently very charming and handsome, in addition to being musical and all that. And she chews him out for making a disgrace of himself. Out there whirling around and et cetera, et cetera. It's basically disgraceful. And David basically blows her off. It has an interesting statement after that. And it says, and she had no further children. So I think their relationship went kapoof when she was reprimanding him for whirling in excitement, bringing the Ark of the Covenant in to Jerusalem. It's an interesting little side story from this, which I'm going to share with you, is that, as you know, that the strict Baptist churches, of which there are some severely strict ones, don't allow dancing. And I had a patient who was a National Baptist pastor, very prominent African-American National Baptist, an African-American church nationally, a good friend of Martin Luther King Jr. and all that. And I said to him, there's nothing scriptural or prohibition against dancing, because King David danced, I said in the nude, it wasn't quite in the nude, in a loincloth, when he brought the Ark into Jerusalem. And he said, yeah, so if you ever wonder what the prohibition is it's not spiritual, it's tradition. And so the explanation, I think, as to why the Baptist churches of that era, the very conservative ones, prohibit dancing. What was a dance hall when the Baptist churches emerged about 1600 in Europe? Dance hall was a brothel. So the rule, the policy was, and they created it to keep the young men out of the brothels, which is a good policy. But it's not scriptural any more than our anti-alcohol policy as a Methodist is scriptural. It's not. That came from the culture at the time, because when John Wesley was ministering to the working class people of England and Wales, their curse was alcohol. They'd work in the mines and they'd get paid in cash, and if they stopped at the ale house or whatever you call it on the way home and drank all their pay up and went home and beat the wives and kids, and they didn't have food and clothes, alcohol was a terrible curse. So he imposed that as a Methodist policy because of the social cultural problems it has. I support that policy. But anyway, this is a good lesson in how complicated church teaching is, sometimes scriptural related and sometimes not. In that situation, there's really nothing in the scriptures to prohibit dancing. I'm a terrible dancer, so I'm not worried about that. So David becomes a regional empire. When we started this a couple weeks ago, I talked about how God had created a situation that allowed this to happen. Traditionally in the Middle East, you had several large empires which went at each other. The Hittites used to be up in Turkey, and they would fight with the Egyptians down around this area as to who controlled this area. This area is traditionally under control from Egypt. Egypt's in a weak phase now. They're basically holding on inside Egypt. They don't have any external control. Hittite Empire disappeared 100 years ago. Just poof. 1 month it was there, and 1 month it was gone, like empires do. The Assyrian Empire had not yet come up. The Babylonian had not yet become an empire. And there's really a power vacuum, and David is able to fill this. And so he's able to conquer all these groups around him. He goes over, crosses the Jordan, and conquers Moab. It's a little bit ironic, because when he was on the run from King Saul in the previous lesson, he took his family to Moab, and the king of Moab protected his family. David comes back 10 years later and conquers them and rules them as a conquered people. That's straight across to the east from Jerusalem and Jericho. It's where Moab is. It's where Jordan is right now, central and southern part of Jordan. He conquered Edom down to the southeast. He conquered the area up into Syria, which is Aram, and that's up into Lebanon and Syria, and they conquered the northern part of Jordan across there. So he ruled this whole area as an empire. He also has evolved away from the tribal administration. When Saul became king, he basically used the tribal administration. He used the tribe to administer their own justice, their own policies. He would work with the tribal leaders, and they would administer it. Saul did not have a large standing army. He had a small bodyguard, but he didn't have a large standing army. He called up the militia, basically, from the tribes. David does it like a typical monarch. He has an imperial court. He builds a palace in Jerusalem. He administers the country through his royal appointees without using the tribal elders. He has a professional army. When he has a problem with Uriah the Hittite, next lesson, that's a person who was from up north in Turkey to be a Hittite, and he was worked for David. He didn't work for the tribes. He had his own bodyguards, etc. And so that is a huge advantage to this royal household, particularly the royal army, because their loyalty is to the king, not to the tribe, not to these other families they've got around. It's to the king, so they're much safer. And finally, there's an interesting story, which is very interesting, about the sole survivor of the King Saul's family. It's a young man, actually by this time he's kind of middle-aged, by the name Merib-el. Merib-el is the son of Jonathan. If you remember back a couple lessons ago, Jonathan and David professed their affection and love for each other, and basically Jonathan is clearly sensing that David's going to end up taking over. He says, well, I want you to be supportive and don't take any action against me or my family or my descendants. And David promises that he will, that he'll be loyal and faithful to this promise to Jonathan. So there is this person named Merib-el, and he's a cripple. It sounds to me like he had 2 club feet, probably from birth, because remember, birth canal problems, you had no solution in those days. Or they claim that he was being held by his nurse, and she was running and she tripped and damaged his feet, which is possible. But I bet he had 2 club feet, and he was pretty immobile. But he's still there, and he's the only grandson that we know of King Saul. So David takes him into the royal household. He insists, "Come and join my royal household. You will eat at my table with us forever." And so this is a twofold issue. One is he does fulfill his promise to Jonathan. He does not eliminate this potential rival, this potential claimant, a person who could be a pretender, is the term they use, someone who claims the throne that someone else had. It's called a pretender. And he does not eliminate him, doesn't kill him off. But he keeps him under his oath, not I. He's got him under thumb now, so if he's dependent on David, he's in David's household. He can't sneak out because he can't walk, or walk very well, and start plotting against David. So he's comfortable there, he's safe, he's secure, but he's also secure to David because David can keep an eye on him. So it's a twofold. It shows how capable David is of understanding the nuances of power and how naturally skillful he is at implementing the royal power, because he preserved his promise to Jonathan, and he he kept this potential pretender who could go out to the other tribes and claim the throne in a safe situation where he couldn't do that. He couldn't rebel. He also restores Saul's estates to the nurse who had been taking care of Merib-el and hiding him basically from everybody else. And he gives her Saul's estates, etc. So that wraps the story up. It's an interesting sideline. But again, remember, we've got a court historian now. So these histories are going to be much more detailed. You'll get conversations, etc. Now, the interesting story about Joab was when he killed Abner. He used the same technique he uses later when he kills the rebellious general who worked for Absalom. He says, "Come over here. Come around this corner of this building. I want to talk to you." So if Joab ever said that to you, you would have said, "No, I'll stay here," because he takes these guys around the corner of the building where no one can see him. He stabs them in the gut and personally kills them. This is the point I make about happened here, and it happens in the next reading of the general who took care of Absalom, who's David's son, who rebelled against him. The only way this could get out is if the court historian asked Joab, "What'd you do?" And he said, "Well, I took him around the room." I went, "Oh." So you show the intimacy of the history that this is even recognized, because there had to be someone there, had to be someone to tell him that. Only could be Joab. So we're going to stop here. We're going to plow through 2 Samuel next. The readings for next week, it's actually not next week, because next week my production crew is going to be on vacation. So for 2 weeks, and it's 2 Samuel chapters 11 through 20. This is the meat of the story. It's fascinating reading. You have Bathsheba and David's affair with her, the murder of her husband. You have the Absalom revolt, and David has to flee, and Joab comes back and wins a battle for him and preserves it. But this is a very interesting story, and it's tremendously well written. So it's 2 Samuel 11 through 20, but it'll be in 2 weeks because my production people are on vacation next week. This is Dr. Guthrie. Been a pleasure.